the second half of the 21st century, climate change century, the heat increased to such an extent that some areas of the Earth were no longer inhabitable. The local causes varied, but they were ultimately always due to the warming of the Earth. In some areas, there was a particularly severe drought. Elsewhere, it was so hot that the forests ignited by themselves, not only in California, but also in the dense jungle. Cities burned. People could not be rescued from the upper floors of the skyscrapers. In the Serengeti, the large fires not only led to large amounts of CO2 being blown into the atmosphere, but also to the destruction of huge amounts of feed for the animals living there. When it burned on the plains of the USA, it was a corresponding loss for the people. Large wheat fields were also destroyed in Ukraine. The heating of the atmosphere also meant that it became energetic, and this energy was discharged in storms of unprecedented proportions. Hurricanes whipped up the sea. They also transported huge masses of water, which then rained down over the land. The storms pushed the water against the coasts, and large cities were also flooded. The flat coastal regions of Bangladesh were completely destroyed by the approaching waves. It had been warned. As early as 1941, Hermann Flohn wrote, "A progression of this very slow increase in temperature must be expected, but this makes human activity the cause of a global climate change, the future significance of which no one can guess." This makes him internationally regarded as one of the first pioneers of the topic in the history of climate change research. This was preceded by a series of scientific findings that later proved to be prerequisites for understanding the world's climate. As early as the end of the 17th century, fossils were used to conclude that it must have been considerably warmer in the early geological period, but that there were also ice ages. The greenhouse effect was discovered by Fourier in 1824. He found that the atmosphere is very transparent to visible light, but not to the infrared radiation emitted by the heated ground. Eunice Foote then discovered in 1856 that carbon dioxide and water vapor play an important role in this. The Swedish physicist Svante Arrhenius was the first to predict global warming due to anthropogenic carbon dioxide emissions in 1896, but that was only a minor aspect for him. On the basis of the global emission rates at the time, he calculated that the carbon dioxide content would double in 3,000 years. At that time, it was simply impossible to imagine how much humanity would burn in the coming decades. The second half of the 20th century was marked by controversial discussions about whether and when the Earth would warm so much. The deniers of climate change did not fall silent at the beginning of the 21st century, but they became quieter and quieter. Since climatologist Hans-Joachim Schellnhuber pointed out that there are elements in the climate system that are prone to changes that are difficult or impossible to reverse, a whole series of tipping elements have been found in the Earth system, including the Greenland ice sheet or the Amazon rainforest. At that time, the years 2014, 15, and 16 were initially the warmest global years since regular climate records began. 2023, a global temperature increase of 3 degrees, was then considered the best estimate. Today we know that this was also far too low. Even then, there was broad scientific agreement that the expected climate change would occur faster than all known warming phases of the last 50 million years. The additional CO2 input will only be gradually reduced, even if emissions are largely stopped, and will still be detectable in several thousand years. A longer warm period in the range of 50 to 100,000 years was expected. In addition, various tipping elements in the Earth system were identified that would initiate short-term and irreversible processes if warming continued to increase. Such developments would seriously change the image of the Earth, especially due to the extensive melting of the West Antarctic and Greenland ice sheets with a corresponding rise in sea level. As we know today, these predictions were not understated. That could be scary, and it was also frightening, especially for young people who could easily calculate that they would have to live in this broken world. One of the first to speak was a 16-year-old student from Sweden who always sat down in front of her school on Fridays with a self-painted cardboard sign that read, "School Strike for the Climate." This was picked up by the press, and what at first seemed childish developed into a worldwide protest movement in a short time. Greta, that was the girl's name, was even invited to speak at the UN General Assembly. There she called out to the representatives of all countries with tears in her eyes. "How dare you destroy this world for us?
How dare you? You have stolen my dreams and my childhood with your empty words, and yet I'm one of the lucky ones."
The moral appeal of the Friday for Future movement evoked a benevolent nod of the head from most. The actions of the last generation, on the other hand, were rejected almost everywhere. Blocking road traffic, smearing works of art, or spraying luxury shops with paint, all these actions did not really seem to affect the problem. Something has been done. Wind farms have been set up worldwide. Photovoltaic systems were built. Overhead lines were erected. But all this was not enough to satisfy the global hunger for energy. Coal continued to be mined and burned on a large scale. Crude oil continued to be extracted and used for heating and driving. People continued to fly to the most remote holiday resorts and consumed vast quantities of kerosene. In the meantime, it didn't matter. In Siberia and northern Canada, the tipping point for the thawing of permafrost soils had long since been passed, and billions of tons of methane were released into the atmosphere every year. And methane is about 80 times more effective than carbon dioxide when it comes to the greenhouse effect. This could no longer be undone by all the efforts of the people. It was getting hotter and hotter, and the people fled in their desperation from the heat and hunger. Those who could still walk went on foot. This was no longer an escape from political persecution or from the war. These were mass emigrations of millions. Anyone who had a cart and a horse or a donkey could at least take something with them, but many were attacked and robbed on their flight. The mass refugees could not really be stopped. More and more people flocked to areas of the world that they believed were still habitable. The flight across the sea was no less dangerous. Thousands of people drowned. The refugees were not welcome anywhere. The borders were fortified and the military made use of firearms. In this way, too, thousands died in the hail of bullets. The earth was strewn with corpses. The military conflicts were not limited to repelling refugees. Wars were fought over food and, above all, over water. Wars, epidemics, famine, floods, hurricanes, and of course the heat itself killed millions and millions of people. Entire areas were depopulated. The infrastructure completely collapsed. But the warming had also led to positive effects. The polar ice caps melted and the North Pole was ice-free, at least in the summer months, so that the route between East Asia and North America could be navigated without detours. This saved time and money. The melting of the polar ice was not a problem in itself, except for the polar bears, of course. The ice at the pole was frozen salt water, which was now returned to its original liquid state. Nor did the sea level rise as a result, unlike at the South Pole, where most of the ice is on land. Gulf Stream carries warm and salty water to the north at the sea surface. There, the water cools down, sinks to the bottom, and then flows back again. A cycle that was often referred to as Europe's district heating, as it brings heat to the British Isles and off the coast of Norway. The melting of the huge ice sheet that covered Greenland also had something good at first. Finally, Greenland became the Greenland again that the Vikings had already called it. Agriculture could now be carried out there, and even strawberries could be harvested. However, the billions of cubic meters of ice that now turned into water were fresh water that flowed into the sea. And fresh water is lighter than salt water. It floats on the salt water, as it were, and does not sink down when it cools down. If the water no longer flows back because it does not sink in the north, this cycle is interrupted. As early as the beginning of the 21st century, it had already been determined that the Gulf Stream was weaker than it had been for 1600 years. However, the final impetus for the drying up of the Gulf Stream came from an event in Central America. The Panama Canal is only a dug canal over a comparatively small distance. Most of it is a very large dammed lake, Lake Gatun. As a result of a monster hurricane in the year 2089, the dams of this lake broke and all the fresh water flowed into the Atlantic. The Gulf Stream, which was already flowing very slowly, then transported this water to the north and then finally stopped. The Gulf Stream was interrupted, and thus Europe's heating was turned off. However, this did not mean that a new ice age began overnight. This was a development over several decades, but quite sudden in the dimensions of Earth's history. It snowed and snowed. The rest of the planet was still being warmed. This part of climate change was not eliminated. But warm air absorbs more moisture and transports more water to the north, where the water was released again in the cold air. The cities in the north were frozen in glaciers in the end. It was no longer possible to live there, but some treasures could still be recovered from the ice. A real boom developed, similar to the gold rush in California. Many adventurers pecked at the ice walls and some found something valuable, but some also fell and died or were seriously injured. People lived sporadically. The groups in which people came together were small. Little was known about the people in the rest of the world.